Okay, so last time I talked a little bit about where plants grow and the soil that they grow from. And this time I'm going to talk about how plants grow. More about a lot of overlapping material, really, but I'm going to be talking a little bit about the life cycle of plants and how plants go about making the substances that that we derive medicinal benefit from, and why plants make those substances, and a little bit about that, and some about the interaction between plants and the environment that they grow in, and how that's relevant to us as herbalists and as students of herbal medicine. So let's see. So I want to start off by talking about sort of what the life cycle of a plant is like. And this is sort of a general blueprint or pattern, if you will, that is common to plants. It's not necessarily completely universal. There are variations to it. There are exceptions to it, but this is often how it goes. When a plant seed germinates, it starts to put out a root. And that's the first thing that comes out of the seed. That's the first thing that hatches out of the seed, is what becomes the root of the plant. If you look at a little wheat sprout or a bean sprout, you see like a little tail type of thing coming out of the seed itself, and that becomes the root. So root, and then leaf, and then flower and fruit is the traditional way of describing it. It's not always flower and fruit, depending on the type of plant, but some either flower and fruit or some analogous structure. So for instance, if you plant a bean in the ground, like I said, the first thing that will happen is the seed will germinate, it'll split open, and a little tail-like appendage will come out. And that will start to become the root. And then as the stem grows up and the root grows down, the two halves of the seed will open out into little leaves, little seed leaves called cotyledons. These seed leaves, there's either one or two of them on flowering plants. On conifers, it's a little bit of a different situation, but the seed leaf will open out, and then the stem will start to grow up above where the two halves of the seed turn into something like leaves, called cotyledons, and they turn green, and they start collecting energy and photosynthesizing. And then the stem grows up from there, and the stem puts out leaves and eventually flowers. Or in some plants, it's not a flower, it's some other type of structure like a cone. And then that gives rise to the reproductive process that produces the next round of seeds. So root, leaf, flower, fruit is a traditional way of describing that. And those are sort of the stages in the life of a plant and sort of the major parts of a plant. The above ground parts, we sometimes would call the aerial parts of a plant. That could be leaf, stem, and flowers on most herbs. It could be, trunk, branches, leaves, flowers, and fruits on trees. And then, of course, the below ground part we collectively refer to as the root system. The root system consists of more than just roots. There are roots. There are also rhizomes, which are essentially underground stems. There can be tubers, which are special organs for storing starches. So, there are multiple different types of structures that grow underground, but we often collectively refer to that, all the underground stuff, as the root system. And what that looks like is different on different plants. But it tends to be present in some form or another. Some plants don't have much in the way of roots. Some plants don't really have much in the way of flowers or leaves either. So there are different plants that have different setups going on, but this is sort of the general pattern. So crucially, for herbal medicine, you have different substances being produced in different parts of the plant. And sometimes these substances can be found all throughout the plant. Sometimes they're found more specifically or much more in a much more concentrated form in one part or another. So there will often be a specific part of a plant that is used. Let's see. One example of this would be echinacea. Echinacea is a plant in the sunflower family. It makes a special type of substance called echinacosides, which have an effect on the immune system, kind of stimulate the immune system. And echinacea is a widely used herb for the immune system and for promoting immune health. And the echinacosides are found they're found throughout the plant, but there's more of them in the root. And also, for practical purposes, the root is a more solid thing. It's more, a pound of roots is a lot smaller than a pound of leaves, for instance. And because the roots are more compact and more solidly built, they lose this substance more slowly, so they have a longer shelf life. So traditionally, people have used the roots as the preferred part of this plant. You can get some benefit from using the above ground part of the plant. When I'm harvesting the plant, I make a tincture out of the above ground part of it while it's fresh, and I also make a tincture out of the root. But the root is stronger, and the root has some things in it that aren't in the leaves. In some plants, you'll have a situation where everything except the fleshy part of the fruit is poisonous. Or you might have something where there are certain very beneficial substances that are mostly found in the leaves, like in mints. In a mint, the root doesn't really have much in it that you would want, neither does the stem. They're basically kind of woody material, but the leaves have all the good stuff. The flowers have a bit of the good stuff too, but they're fairly insubstantial. So, you know, on mentha, on spearmint, you would want the leaves. On echinacea, you want the root. So very often there are different substances in different plants. Last week we talked about dandelion and how the leaves have more of an affinity for the kidneys because of their sour taste, and the root has more of an affinity for the liver because of its bitter taste. And all of this is because of how plants grow. All of this is because of the life processes of plants and how those work, which we'll get into a little more as this class goes along tonight. But to begin with, I want to say that the roots are in the ground. They take in water and they take in whatever's dissolved in that water, which is often some minerals. The leaves are up in the air and they breathe in and they breathe out. And at the same time, they also are soaking up energy from the sun and using it to power the life processes of the plant. They provide the energy for the life processes of the plant. And by extension, they provide the life processes, energy for the life processes of the animals that eat the plants, and then by even further extension, the animals that eat those animals, and the decomposers and scavengers that eat all of them when they die and things like that. So all the energy in the ecosystem enters through the leaves of a plant. It's a huge, almost, to me, somewhat cosmic and mystical that plant leaves are able to, you know, be the source of life for everything on land. That they're providing us all these nutrients and all this energy. So basically, the way that this is happening is inside of the sun. You have protons colliding with one another, subatomic particles colliding with one another, smashing together and turning into helium nuclei, and in so doing, releasing radiant energy that goes out into the universe, just like it does from every other star out there. And in the case of our star, we happen to be close enough that our planet soaks up a fair bit of that. And the plants that grow on it have figured out how to take that energy and use it to power this process called photosynthesis. And in photosynthesis, I mentioned this a little bit last time, but I think it bears some repeating because it is kind of the foundation for a lot of the physiology of herbal medicine in general. The leaves and the plant in general are taking water, and they're taking carbon dioxide from the air, and also nitrogen from the air that's being fixed by bacteria. They're taking all of these things and turning them into a few big categories of substances. They're making most of the plant, most of the substances that are in plants that make them medicinal are mostly made up of just a few different types of atoms. They contain other atoms in very small amounts, other elements in very small amounts, but the main things that it's all made up out of are most especially carbon, which tends to form the backbone of living things at a molecular level. Then there is oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Those four things make up the bulk of most of the molecules that are in plant medicines. Make up the bulk of a lot of the molecules involved in life in general. But for the moment, most of the things that are in plant medicine are combinations of those with a few other things scattered here and there. You know, occasionally there will be a phosphorus atom or a sodium or potassium ion or something that is part of a plant molecule, but mostly it's made up out of those few things, which in turn are made up out of air and water and energy from the sun. So that's really this amazing, irreplaceable thing that plants are doing to keep all of us alive all the time. You know, we're sort of all on plant-based life support from the time that we're born until the time that we die. And this is part of how that works, is that plants are able to turn that energy into forms of energy that our body can use, like carbohydrates and amino acids. And then also they make them into a lot of different groups of substances like alkaloids and organic acids that are medicinal for us. So I hope that doesn't sound too esoteric or preachy or anything, but I think it's really amazing. And I think it's a really useful thing for us to remember as we're entering into serious study of herbal medicine, is that this is all, you know, that this is the source of all life in the world, and that it's all based on plants and their interaction with the sun and our interactions with them. And that's a very natural part of being alive, being a person, being a living thing on planet Earth, is relying on plants for your health and using plants to improve your health. So really what we're doing with herbal medicine is just a refinement of that basic instinct that all humans and all living things have of using plants to keep us alive. So when you go outside, look around, and, like I said last time, you'll notice that different plants are growing in different types of places, different types of environments. With wild plants, they are trying to fill in every niche, every different possible type of place to live that there is in the environment. With cultivated plants, it's a little bit of a different story. Humans have chosen to cultivate some plants for particular reasons, often for food, and we're trying to grow plants that will get a lot of sunlight, soak up a lot of sunlight, turn it into a lot of calories of food, and be able to support, a large population, and the large populations, animals, and everything like that. Maybe even running some vehicles on them these days and stuff like that. So, people are growing immense amounts of energy in plant form, and that's one way that plants can be, but they're not always. When you look at wild plants, it's not always like that. It's not always just the things that grow in direct sun and make a lot of food. There are also things that grow in almost complete shade. There are things that grow in partial sun, and so forth. So sun is a huge factor in determining what grows where. Water is a huge factor in determining which plants grow in which places. And soil type is another huge factor in that. So to get back to the plant cycle of root, leaf, flower, and fruit, you have these leaves that are photosynthesizing, and they're storing up energy. They're storing up energy in the form mostly of carbohydrates. And they're also using those carbohydrates to build the plant, to build the physical structure of the plant. And then they have all sorts of different survival strategies. And these different survival strategies are often part of where their medicinal properties come from. So, for instance, there are a lot of bitter plants out there that are not good tasting, that contain alkaloids, which have some strong physiological action. And a lot of the time, plants are trying to contend with two different main things that might eat them. One is larger grazing animals, and the other is insects. So a lot of the time, there will be things in plants that are basically poisonous to insects and unpleasant to larger grazing animals. It doesn't really necessarily do a plant any good to kill the larger grazing animals. And the larger grazing animals, including ourselves, tend to have livers and other systems that are pretty well designed to keep us from dying from eating plants. There are some plants that will still do it to you, but not so many. And most of them taste terrible. So a lot of the time, when we start eating something that's an alkaloid, you can tell that it's not something you want to eat. It's very bitter. So if you were to go up and start chomping down on an opium poppy or something like that, it would taste terrible. The texture would be terrible. It's prickly. It's got this sticky sap in it. It's intensely bitter. You're not going to try and mistake this for a vegetable. It's not, it is a vegetable, but not a vegetable you want to eat. So people generally aren't going to eat them in that state. They might let them go to seed and then eat the seeds, which don't have so much of the bitterness in them, and which would be consumed in a very tiny quantity anyway. But not so much the leaves and the parts that have the bitter alkaloids in them. So this is a survival strategy for the plants. If a beetle, a little tiny bug, starts chewing on the plant, it's going to get engulfed in the sap, and it's probably going to kill it. If it's a nibbling mouse or something, the sap is going to be too strong for it. It's not going to be able to eat it either. And if it's a cow or a person or something, then the same thing. They might eat a leaf or two before they decide, oh, that's terrible. So these things have substances in them that affect our nervous systems, but they're not necessarily trying to, for the most part, at least not initially. There will be plants out in the world that have a variety of different substances in them that have a variety of different effects on people. In the case of a poppy, it makes people or animals lethargic, tired, maybe even paralyzed, at least temporarily. And in large enough quantities, it would cause respiratory failure and death. But those quantities are not that easily consumable by accident. So that tends to be the type of situation with plants. There are some plants, like I said, that will cause death, that are that dangerous. Poison hemlock is probably the most common one around here. But again, it doesn't taste very good. It doesn't lend itself to accidental consumption so much. Yeah, there's a question about what about our pets, and when they start nibbling on unknown plants. And for the most part, I mean, that is a concern because, animals can be kind of random and things like that. Sometimes they're just bored, especially dogs. Dogs will sometimes, because they're scavengers, they will sometimes eat things that taste pretty terrible. So it's important to rein them in if you see them doing that. But it's very also normal for them to just eat some grass and make themselves throw up. That's just something that they do. But with other plants, it's probably best not to let them, just because they might, consume too much of it. But for the most part, they're going to know that something tastes bad. No guarantees about that. But for the most part, if something is poisonous and they start chewing on it, they're not going to like the taste of it. And sometimes it's going to make them foam at the mouth or something, because they can't really spit the way that we do. So they just drool a bunch. So dogs mostly drool, cats kind of foam if they get a hold of something bad. But, for the most part, their sense of taste and smell is pretty sensitive, because they're designed to be able to figure that sort of thing out for themselves. So alkaloids are bitter substances in plants that are generally unpleasant to people, generally toxic to invertebrates, bugs, things like that, snails, and so forth, smaller animals with less sophisticated nervous systems, and often have a strong effect on people's physiology. So a lot of our really powerful medicines that come from plants, like opium, like belladonna, like digitalis, these are all examples of alkaloids that are very strong medicines that come from bitter tasting plants. So there are also other substances in plants that are organic acids, and these things will generally also be destructive to invertebrates that try to eat them, and kind of nauseating to larger animals. So for example, oak bark, the bark of oak tree, you're probably not just going to go up and start chewing on an oak tree like corn on the cob or anything like that. But if you did, it wouldn't poison you. It would make you throw up. If some small insects do it, it will actually sort of pickle their insides. With a human, it's not going to do that. Our insides are a little more compartmentalized, and it's going to start trying to do that, and then your body's going to reject it. And so a long time ago, people figured out that they could use oak for a couple of different things, one of which is sort of pickling the outside of a wound, putting an acidic, astringent irrigation on it that will tighten up the tissue and firm it up and keep things from growing in it. And the other one of which is purging the stomach. If somebody drinks infusion of oak, it will generally make them undrink it pretty much right away. And so this process of actually drinking something like that and then throwing it up is called gastric lavage, and it does have some clinical applications for people who have been poisoned or taken too much medicine. And it used to be used a lot as purging, like if somebody felt nauseous, you'd give them something to make them throw up and then they'd feel better. And I think we've all experienced that kind of spontaneously, just in the course of being sick sometimes. But it's not necessarily the approach that I would take if someone came to me and they were nauseous. I would try and give them something to relieve the nausea without them throwing up. But oak has been used for that, and I keep oak. I keep a solution made from oak in my first aid stuff in case I'm at a festival or something and somebody's accidentally or maybe even intentionally taking too much of a drug or something. It's a way that you can get that out of someone's system quickly, get it back out of their stomach before it gets into their bloodstream, really. So it's not technically in their system, it's just about to enter their system, because the inside of your stomach really isn't your system yet. It's more of a surface of your body. But anyway, organic acids are a huge, huge collection of different substances. And a lot of them are astringent, like what I just described. A lot of them have a whole bunch of other properties. Some of them are anti-inflammatory. Some of them even have effects on the nervous system. So for instance, valerian contains a substance called valeric acid. Using another naming convention, you can call it pentanoic acid. But it is something that is calming to the nervous system, and it's historically has been used to stabilize the mood and to prevent seizures. So it's, and there's a whole class of seizure drugs that are kind of based on it, on patentable variations of that same molecule. So that's an acid too. It's what's called an aromatic acid. It's structured a little bit differently and it has a strong scent to it. So there are a bunch of those. The stuff that's in oak is not aromatic, but it's what's called a tannin. Tannins are a category of plant substances that are astringent, and lots of plants have tannins in them for the same reason that I described with oak. It's something that will make insects that are eating them unable to digest anymore, and will at least upset the digestion of larger grazing animals in some cases. With some of the plants that have tannins in them, some animals are designed or developed or whatever, adapted to be able to eat them. So deers can eat tree leaves that have some tannin in them. They won't eat oak leaves if there's anything better to eat, but they can if they have to. There are some plants that grow out in the fields that contain lesser amounts of tannins, and horses and cows eat them without any trouble. And humans can use them as medicine too, but too much of them would be upsetting to the stomach. So there are a whole bunch of different substances in that category. There are a whole bunch of different substances in the organic acids category. And there are a bunch of other types of organic acids. Some of which, like folic acid, are really necessary for human life, and most of which are not specifically things that you will die without, but they are things that are ubiquitous in a natural diet that you're going to have some of in your diet, as long as you're eating like real things that are from out there in the world and not just ready-made off-the-shelf stuff that doesn't have a lot of plant substances in it. So all of these substances are being made from carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen, being arranged in different ways. Because these substances are not things that are vital to the survival of the plant, or they might be vital to the survival of the plant. They are survival strategies, but they are not primary things that are to do with the plant's vital functions. So for instance, cellulose and sugars, we would consider those primary plant substances because plants need to have them to be alive. The tannin helps to keep the plant from getting killed. It's defensive, but the plant doesn't need it to be alive in the first place. And so we would call that a secondary phytochemical. And most of the substances that we're concerned about in herbal medicine are secondary phytochemicals because they're different in all these different plants. And There's a huge variety of them, and they do different things when they come in contact with human physiology. So, if you have ever chopped up an onion and felt your eyes watering, that's because of some sulfur compounds called isothiocyanates that are found in onions and that become airborne as you're chopping it up, and that are irritating to some extent to the mucous membranes. Now, that can be used to your advantage if somebody's eyes were too dry, for instance, or if they were taking it internally to help move the fluids in their body and get more moisture into their sinuses and into their eyes and so forth. So, it does have a potential therapeutic use, but it can also be irritating. And that's, the onions. Onions are an interesting case because people have grown onions for a long, long time. So apparently, originally, onions had these things in there to keep animals from eating them. You come along, you start grazing on an onion, oh, it's too spicy, you go eat something else. But people, being what they are like, oh, a little bit of this would be nice in a dish. So we chop it up and we mix it with other things and start eating it. And then people started growing onions. People started growing them on purpose. And when people started growing them on purpose, that changes the game a little bit, because people might think, oh, I want a spicy onion. Let's, crossbreed these ones that were spicy and see if we can get a spicy breed of onions going, a spicy variety of onions going. And so then you have that. Or people might think the opposite, of like, oh, I want onions, but I want a big onion without a whole lot of the spiciness in it. And so they grow a big sweet onion. So once people start cultivating plants, a lot of the time, the survival strategy in that case is for the plant to have the characteristics that humans want so that humans keep planting it. And so you get things like, you get a lot of varieties of cultivated things that have maybe strong amounts of, or different or unique types of secondary phytochemicals. Hang on just a second. There was a question about onions, and I'm going to go back to that. Is it true that onions can help heal scars? Yes, they can. There's a couple of things that onions do with regard to that, but one of the most significant things is that they increase the circulation to the area. And it's because of these same slightly irritating phytochemicals, these sulfur compounds. Sulfur compounds can actually reduce deeper pain sometimes, but when they're used topically, they will increase the amount of blood flow to an area. And with scars, that will often help them to heal, or help them to at least be less stiff and less adhesive, less sunken in, and things like that. So they don't always make them go all the way away, but they often make them softer and more pliable. And they do that, and they can help. Scars do heal some over the course of years, and onions can help speed that process up. So yeah, that is definitely the truth, or a possible outcome. Hang on just a second. So with a lot of medicinal plants, there are a lot of cultivated medicinal plants. There are a wide range of different varieties. Peppers are another really good example. Within the same species, Capsicum annuum, which is what cayenne peppers are, and it's what bell peppers are too. They're different varieties that have been cultivated for different characteristics, different genetics. And it mostly has to do with their genetics and not their growing conditions. But it does have a little to do with their growing conditions, but mostly it's genetics. You get some peppers that are sweet, some peppers that are spicy. Usually if you plant the seeds from a sweet pepper, you'll get more sweet peppers. So people have bred them for those particular characteristics. People have cultivated those particular characteristics. And so you have some peppers that are very, very spicy because people have selected for those genetics. And some of them are maybe, many, many times more spicy than your basic cayenne pepper. And your basic cayenne pepper is probably more spicy and different from whatever the wild precursor of pepper plants was. Where you get bell peppers and paprika peppers, which are the same plant, but different varieties that don't have really any spiciness to them. So, there are a lot of varieties within that one type of plant, that one species. You get a lot of different, we sometimes call them cultivars in terms of gardening, which means just a cultivated variety. Sometimes people in plant research will also refer to chemovars, which means a chemical variety or a different one that is different, not necessarily based on genetics, although it usually is genetics, but different based on what substances are present in it. And that's what's being used to categorize them. So you get these different varieties at any rate, and they can have very different levels of different substances in them. The same is true with mints. There are some very minty spearmints out there, and there are some that don't have any mintiness to them at all, and they've been cultivated for different purposes. The mints that are used to make mint chutney usually don't have that much mintiness to them. The mints that are used to make mint tea usually have a lot of mintiness. And then in addition to that, you get different processes, like, for example, distilling the oil from them, which can concentrate it, 100 times more than it would be in nature. And so you get different products made from them that can be very different. But even just the plant itself, based on its genetics, can be very different from one variety to the next. So when plants are making substances, they for the most part are making them to protect themselves from being eaten. Often we end up eating them for those same substances, but in small amounts usually. Sometimes the substances are not necessarily for that. For instance, a lot of plants contain what are called saponins, basically soap-like substances. And sometimes those substances are just there to help water to be retained in the plant. They keep the plant from drying up. Yucca root is an example of this. It's a sort of a desert plant. It grows here in Kentucky too, but it also grows out in the desert. And it has soap in the root. You can actually slice the root up and mix it in warm water, and the water turns soapy, and you can shake it and it'll turn to suds and everything. So that substance is really not so much there to keep the root from being eaten. It's mostly there to keep it from drying out. But it does have medicinal properties, and it does have kind of practical utilitarian household uses as well. So there are a lot of things like that out there in the plant world also. But often the secondary phytochemicals are there to keep them from being eaten. And often they are the sort of effect that they have on humans is maybe kind of secondary. We tend to think about it in terms of ourselves. Like we'll say something like, well, I don't know, that this plant is for this thing. Ginger is for inflammation, and ginger is great for inflammation, but the ginger isn't producing these substances that are anti-inflammatory so that humans will come along and dig it up and use it necessarily. I mean, I'm not saying that isn't part of some sort of divine plan somewhere out there or whatever. That's beyond my knowledge. But just as far as the actual pressures that lead to the plant growing these substances and that sort of thing, it usually has more to do with what is in its environment that might eat it. So the plants are producing these substances, and they're storing them in different places. Often plants will have, there are a few different things that plants have growing on with their seeds, because for plants, a big part of what they're doing with their lives is trying to make more plants, trying to survive, to reproduce so that the population continues. And there are often different strategies around what that involves. So for instance, an apple, for instance, has this edible outside surface, and then it has a poisonous seed in the middle, right? So animals, possibly including humans, we usually don't eat the core and the seeds, but when we could. But if it was a deer or a pig or something like that that doesn't have the dexterity that we have, it's just going to eat the whole thing. It's not going to chew up the seeds if it can help it, because they taste bad, but it's going to eat the outside part, swallow the seeds and everything, and poop it out somewhere else. And then you have the seed already planted in this nice fertile soil. And then it has a good chance to start growing. So a lot of plants have something like that. And a lot of medicinal plants are distributed by birds who eat fruit and then distribute the seeds. There are quite a few plants here in eastern Kentucky, in the mountains and in the woodlands, that have a little bit of sweet flesh stuck to the seeds that's not big enough to interest a deer or a bird, but that ants will go for. And this is called an eliazome. Bloodroot has them. Trilliums have them. Some other plants have them. But the ants will eat this little bit of sweet flesh that's attached to the seed, and they'll take it down into their nest with them to do so. And then the plant seed is way underground and can start growing. So it's actually cultivated by ants. Ants grow them, and then ants harvest the seeds the next year, and they plant new seeds, and then they come back up. So actually, it's sometimes many years and many, many lifetimes of ants between the time that a trillium goes from seed to being a mature plant, or the bloodroot does too, a couple years, but that's still a long time for ants. So they have a symbiotic relationship where the ants are getting something out of the deal, the plants are getting something out of the deal. And same with the birds and the raspberries, or the birds and pokeberries. Pokeberries are, again, they have a poisonous seed, like the apples do. And everything on the plant is poisonous except the fleshy part of the berry, which doesn't really taste like much to a human. I've tasted them before. It doesn't really taste good, but it, has some sugars in it or whatever. Birds eat them. Birds need to eat all the time because they're tiny and have a really fast, high metabolism and consume a lot of energy flying around. So they need to take in a lot of calories. If anybody ever says they ate like a bird, then, maybe they mean they ate twice their weight in food that day, because that's what birds do. But humans are not capable of that. But yeah, total amount that a bird eats might be small. Amount that it eats compared to its body weight, probably pretty large. So these different plants have different relationships with animals, and the relationship that they have with humans historically has also been one of mutual benefit. Humans might be inclined to keep areas of woodland that they don't cut down because medicines grow there. And they might, go out and find patches of medicine and scatter the seeds so that they will continue to grow there. And this is very much part of the culture that I grew up in, and I think it's very much a part of a lot of traditional cultures, is that people know where medicine is that grows around them, and they take care of it because it takes care of them. And with some plants like dandelion, you don't really have to do much. Dandelions are going to persist even if you don't want them to. With other plants like ginseng, golden seal, things like that, people have tended to not exactly cultivate them, but sort of steward the wild stands of them. Go out and find places where these things are growing in the forest, make sure that they're not getting cut down, that the trees over them aren't getting cut down, make sure that the seeds are getting replanted at the end of each year, and so forth, so that that stand of plants continues to grow and continues to produce the medicine that people need. Sometimes also plants are just kind of like hitchhikers. They're along for the ride. Humans aren't necessarily trying to produce dandelion habitat when they cut all the grass short. But the dandelions love it because they can grow up above the grass and get sunlight. Whereas if it were a tall field of grass, the dandelions would be kind of down in the shade of the grass and they wouldn't get the sunlight that they need, and the wind wouldn't blow their seeds very far and stuff like that. So people are inadvertently creating a wonderful habitat for dandelions by keeping their grass cut short in the suburbs, even though that's explicitly not what they mean to do. You know, that's not why they're doing it. And a lot of them, you know, feel like it's worth spraying a carcinogen on their lawn to keep from having the dandelions. But the dandelions, you know, they come along anyway. They're very persistent and they're very adaptable. So the flowers that plants produce are often also part of their survival strategy. You know, many of these plants produce flowers that attract pollinators, and so that they can do that through smell and through color. And the same substances that make those smells and those colors often have medicinal properties. A lot of bright colorations in plants are caused by antioxidants, which are substances that have anti-inflammatory effects in the human body. And a lot of the aromatic scents that plants produce to attract insects might also have decongestant properties or antibacterial properties in humans. So you get things like lavender and mint, thyme leaves. All of these have medicinal properties in humans from their flowers that are designed to attract insects, pollinating insects by smell. So, you know, the nectar that plants produce is often just sort of a it's the plant sacrificing some of the energy that's harvested, because that nectar has calories in it, in exchange for the ability to move that the insects have that the plants don't really have. And sometimes the ability to do other things too. I'll tell you a fascinating example. We have a vine here in central Kentucky called trumpet creeper. It's one of the few wildflowers around here with orange flowers. It's a vine, a woody vine with orange flowers. If you look for it in the summertime, you'll see it. It's not rare. It grows in the city as well as in the country. It will grow up telephone poles and fences and things like that. A lot of people think it's a weed, but it's a native plant. It's a native wildflower. And so it has these long trumpet-shaped orange flowers that produce a lot of nectar, but it also has nectar glands all over its body. It has them on the stems, it has them on the leaves, it has them on the outside of the flower. And guess what you get when you have a bunch of sugary, sticky stuff just sitting around outside? You get ants. So this plant, if you start walking in this plant and trampling on it and that sort of thing, the ants are going to get you. So these sweet feeding ants are sort of its bodyguards, and they protect the trumpet creeper. Is their home, or it's, you know, it grows. They live underground mostly, but it grows where they live, and they come up and eat the sweet that's growing on it, the nectar, and they also defend it from other insects and sometimes from larger animals that might come plodding on through. And so it actually is a mutually beneficial situation where the plant is giving up some of its calories, some of its energy that it's stored up, because most plants are capable of making more energy than they need for their own vital functions. So it's giving some of that up for pollinators, but also it's giving some of it up for the ants that just crawl around all over it and make it a less pleasant habitat for other animals that might damage it to come into. And we have a couple different plants around like that, but trumpet creeper is probably the most dramatic example, and it's a very recognizable plant because of its orange flowers. So those are some things that you know, some different strategies that plants have as far as making different substances so that they can attract different creatures. They can attract the notice of different animals, and they can provide some medicinal benefit to different animals. Whether that's in the form of food or whether it's in the form of antioxidants and so forth. But animals eat plants to keep themselves healthy. And a lot of what humans learn about plants originally was probably from watching animals. Some of it was probably from tasting the plants and, not noticing that certain tastes went along with certain properties. For example, that something that was too sour would eventually produce a purge through vomiting, or something that was very bitter would eventually produce a purge through diarrhea, that sort of thing. So, something that was spicy would make the blood flow to an area. Something that felt cooling would maybe take away the sting of something that felt hot. So, people have noticed these things. People have noticed patterns for at least as long as they've been writing about it. So when people think of it as being trial and error, that's not completely right. Trial and error might have come into it, but a lot of it was about recognizing patterns and describing patterns. And so you can read very ancient herbal medicine texts from some of the earlier places that wrote down stuff about herbal medicine, like China and India, where they have whole systems that they've worked out of things being hot, cold, wet, dry, things like that, and the different sorts of reactions you could expect different medicines to provoke based on those types of characteristics. And in herbal medicine, when we talk about those types of characteristics, like hot and cold or wet and dry, people sometimes call those energetics. I don't know why they chose that word for it, but that's what you'll often see that word in the herbal community. Somebody's talking about the energetics of garlic. That's the kind of thing that they're talking about. They're not talking about the caloric content, which is what I would have meant if I said the energetic something of garlic, the energetic capacity or whatever. But no, that's not what people mean by it. They mean the fact that it's hot and that it's moist and so forth. So it provokes a stinging sensation, and it provokes flow of fluids like tears, or flow of blood to an area. So in your own readings and stuff, you might often come across these terms, these kinds of terms, energetics. And there are different traditional energetic systems in some places, like in the Chinese and Indian manuscripts. Though there will be more complicated ways of describing these things. The concept of yin and yang is probably something you've heard before, that's kind of like the yin is like the cool, dark side of things, and the yang is like the bright, light, hot kind of things. So they're, kind of more complicated systems of energetics that people have worked out over the course of thousands of years. And there are similar systems from Europe and from Northern Africa, and probably from everywhere else in the world too. I'm just not as familiar with them, but they're it's something that people notice about plants. So there are certain patterns to how they taste and what those tastes do, and so forth. Let's see, are trilliums still endangered? I am not sure that they are on an endangered species list, but they are very environmentally sensitive. They are very vulnerable to overharvesting because it can take a decade or sometimes even more for a trillium seed to become a blooming trillium plant. And if it's killed at any point during that, then it doesn't get to make more seeds. So it doesn't get to replace itself, so the population would dwindle. So I'm not sure that they're technically considered endangered, but they're something that if you were going to harvest, you would want to do so with a lot of care. And, I would say you really want to get to know the plants, and you really want to get to know not just the individual plants, but the plant community that it's growing in. And that's another critical thing about where plants grow is that they don't just grow. You don't usually just find a single plant of a particular type growing somewhere. You find what we call a stand of plants. If the stand only had one member, you would want to leave it completely alone and let it see if it survives, and let it see if it can turn into a stand with multiple members. But with something like Trillium or ginseng, or even with dandelions, you'll often find a big group of them living together. And that's a stand of plants. And when we harvest plants, we should be looking at the stand and thinking about the health of the stand. Maybe you're going to kill this individual plant by digging it up, but you want to make sure that this patch of Trilliums, or this patch of dandelions, or this patch of whatever it is going to continue. Dandelions are kind of, maybe people don't feel that way about them, but they're fairly, they're not very threatened. They're not very vulnerable. But generally speaking, you don't want to overharvest any kind of plant. You want to respect the community of plants that it's part of, and you want to only take maybe one plant out of 10, or some very small amount like that. Some people say 1 out of 10 for roots and 1 out of 3 for the above ground parts of plants. I say pay attention to that particular plant and that particular stand and figure out what it needs. Because I know of plants where if I took 1 out of 3 of the above ground part of the plant, it would decimate the stand pretty quickly. It would eradicate the stand in a few years because they grow slowly. An example of that would be, there's a plant that grows in the woods here called partridge berry. And it's just sort of like a little creeping vine that grows out in the woods, has little tiny red berries that birds eat. It's used as a tonic for the female reproductive system. And it's slow growing, not easy to cultivate, kind of grows where it will and doesn't grow where you try to plant it. But I have certain stands of it that I've been picking from for about 40 years. And what that consists of is just going out with some scissors and trimming a little bit off here and a little bit off there, and not uprooting any particular plant, not pulling up a whole stand or anything, but just little trim here and there, and the stand keeps growing and keeps thriving. So to start out with, for those of you who are just getting started, I would say, if you're going to pick plants that live near you, I think that's a wonderful thing to do. It's a great opportunity to experience things hands-on, to get to know them, stuff like that. But think about what the life cycle is of that plant and how long it's going to take for it to make more of itself, and make your choices accordingly about how much of it you would take, so that you don't over harvest or harvest in a way that makes it so that the stand tends to dwindle over time. And with some plants that grow in communities that change, like for example, dandelions again, they're not very vulnerable to over harvesting, but one thing that they are vulnerable to, as far as a particular stand of dandelions go, not them as a species, but as far as a particular stand of dandelions grow, is the plant community around them changing. So if right now something is a cut suburban yard, they'll grow there. If you let it go for 5 years and you come back and it's tall grass and maybe some small bushes and things starting to grow in amongst it, there will be a lot less of the dandelions. And if you come back 70 years later and it's tall forest and it's just been allowed to go to forest, or even if you come back 25 years later and it's all covered in blackberry bushes, you're probably not going to find a significant number of dandelions in the midst of that at all. So they are vulnerable to, or they are subject to, the changing populations of the plant community. Now, with plants that live in what's called a climax community, which is like a mature forest in this area, in some other areas it might be certain types of desert habitat or whatever, but here, if you let something go long enough, it'll eventually turn into a forest with big trees. Plants that grow in that type of situation, you can go and harvest from the same stand year after year and generation after generation, and still have a healthy stand of whatever woodland root crops you're harvesting, or whatever woodland greens you're harvesting, because it will stay the same type of plant community pretty much indefinitely until and unless something happens, like if the area got logged, which is a more usual thing, or if there were a very severe forest fire or a tornado or something like that, an ice storm that knocked down a lot of the trees and opened up the canopy, and that would change the situation on the ground as well. But for the most part, they'll stick around for a really long time. So when you are outside in the next few days, over the course of the next week or whatever, look around at what kind of plant communities are growing around you, what kind of groups of the same type of plant you might find, and what kind of other plants are growing in the same area as them. And so, whether that's if you're looking at farm fields, or if you're looking at forests, or if you're looking at an urban habitat, a suburban habitat, something like that, or even a park, you'll see different types of plants in all of those situations, and different groups of plants, and different areas where different plants are trying to grow. Just like I said last time, a week ago, just like I said then, you will often, in one small area, you'll find different types of plant communities growing. Like maybe you'll have a ditch that's full of honeysuckle bushes, and then a field that's full of grass, and then maybe you'll have a row of big walnut trees or something like that. That would be something you would see in a very created environment. But it's not implausible at all to have those three different types of microhabitat in close proximity to each other in this area. And if you're going outside this time of year, some things you might look out for are the honeysuckle bushes are coming towards the end of their flowers. They have white flowers that turn yellow just before they fall off. There are some big tall trees, locust trees, that have white flowers on them, big clusters of white flowers on them. They're very lovely, and they just started blooming recently. You'll notice that most of the trees have leafed out. Some of them haven't yet. Some of them, like the walnuts, have flowers and leaves on them at the same time. And if you're looking in the grass, you'll see dandelions, still a few violets here and there, and various other plants that are starting to come into bloom. So it's a great time to go out there and find plants to press in a book for your plant collection. And it's also a great time to just go out there and see what's growing, and see if you can find out what it is, see if you can learn some of the flowers and other plants that are growing in your vicinity. Yes, mulberries. Mulberries are green right now here in central Kentucky. At least the ones that I've seen are, and they will be ripe in probably less than 2 weeks. And they're a really nice early flush of berries. They're one of the first things in this environment that produces a whole lot of food that you can maybe stock up on. If you wanted to have, some freezer bags full of mulberries, you might be able to go out and get those. Black raspberries fruit just after mulberries, and blackberries fruit just after the black raspberries. So those are very similar plants, but they fruit separately, or there's some overlap, but the black raspberries fruit significantly earlier than the blackberries. They eat about the same though. So all of that is going on in the next month and a half or so. So lots of exciting developments as far as wild plants. It's a question, do mushrooms count for our collection project? So yeah, you could count mushrooms. Obviously, you're not going to press a mushroom probably. I mean, maybe you could, but with most mushrooms, it wouldn't work so well. But if you're taking photos and you want to take photos of some mushrooms, and you're able to identify them and document the same stuff, which is common name, the the Latin binomial, the location where you found it, and whatever you know about it, then I think that's fine. Mushrooms can form a big part of herbal medicine too. For instance, I've got some lion's mane extract right here. This is good stuff. I use it a lot for mental clarity and energy and focus. Over here, I've got some reishi, which is another medicinal mushroom that has some immune system effects and some effects that are more targeted towards the nervous system. So yeah, there are a lot of great edible and medicinal mushrooms out there. Hang on just a minute, drink of water, and I'll be right back. And I'm going to talk about a couple of different medicinal herbs. All right. So the first herb that I want to talk about is plantain. I'm actually going to step outside and see if I see some. Plantain is, strangely enough, the common name for two completely unrelated plants, two completely unrelated categories of plants at that. So there is a cooking banana that's called plantain. Plantains as cooking bananas are not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about a little weed that goes by the Latin name Plantago. And there are a few different species of Plantago. And you can find them just about anywhere that there's grass. They're very common weeds in the temperate zones of North America and probably a lot of other places. So let's see. Hang on just a second. Oh, I've just stepped outside of my clinic and found some grass. And now I'm looking for plantain, which is, like I said, a pretty common weed that people will often find in grassy places. This grass has been cut recently, which makes it a little bit harder to identify if it's had its head chopped off. But there should be some back here somewhere. Here we go. This is Plantago lanceolata. There are a couple different species of Plantago, and this is a really common one. It's called Plantago lanceolata. The leaves look kind of like grass, and then the seed heads are like little antennas. If you flip it over, it has very deep veins that stick out, and it grows in what's called a basal rosette, which means that it comes out all different directions from one central point. So that is Plantago lanceolata. There's also a Plantago major, which looks a little bit different. And I don't see any of it here right at this moment. But both of them are very common plants of lawns and whatever this is, fence rows, things like that. And so this is a really great first aid plant. It's a really good one to teach the kids. And it's a really good one to know yourself. If you crush it up, some juice comes out of it, and it's a little bit slippery, and it's green, and feels a little bit slimy like aloe. So this is a plant that you can use on bug bites and stings, and it will take most of the pain and stinging out of it right away. You can also crush it up in a mortar and pestle and get a significant amount of juice on it. You can put it on sunburns and things like that, and it will help to take the pain out of those. So it's a very good, versatile medicinal plant that is found just about everywhere. And you can see this is how far I had to walk outside from that door right there to right over here. Just, a few feet, and most of it was pavement. To be able to find an example of this plant. And there are a lot of plants like that. There are a lot of medicinal plants that grow where people live and that are adapted to human habitation and the sorts of changes that human habitation makes to the environment. And a lot of those same plants are ones that humans have a lot of experience with, and so we know what to expect from them as medicines. Just about all plants have medicinal properties. Sometimes we know about them and sometimes we don't, but in the cases of the ones that are our very near neighbors, we've very likely been using them as medicines since time out of mind, since far longer than anybody's been writing anything down about it. So Plantago is not something that you would probably find at the herb store usually. There's actually a species of Plantago called Psyllium that's grown for its seeds, which have a laxative property. But this common Plantago has never really become a commercial product, partly because everyone already has it. You can't sell it because everyone already has it. It's in everyone's yard. It's there for free. It doesn't belong to anybody. It doesn't, have a brand or a patent or anything like that attached to it. It's just, part of the common inheritance of humankind. And so it's out there, and if you get to know it, you can use it. And like I said, I find it to be a really useful one to, it's a good first herb to teach young people, because they're always stepping on bees and hurting themselves. If you crush it up and put it on a splinter, it's going to often draw the splinter out of the wound channel, as well as relieving pain, as well as having a slight antibacterial effect. So it has a wide variety of different things. And medicinally, some of what's in it includes tannic acids, like what I was talking about with oak. Those same types of substances are in this, and they give it its astringent properties. And in addition to that, it contains a different type of organic acid called salicylates or salicin, which are anti-inflammatory substances. And also they'll help bruises go away if you crush it up and poultice it on a bruise. So, and they're pain relieving. And so it has all of those properties. And then in addition to that, some of the starches that are in it, that are part of how it stores food, give it a slippery texture when it's crushed up. The water that's in it mixes with the starches that are in it, and they create a slippery, cooling, gelatinous or gel type of texture that is soothing to the skin and soothing for burns and rashes and things like that. So if you didn't know any other medicinal herbs, it's one you could use for a whole wide variety of different things. It actually has even more uses than all that. You can make it into a tea, and it will help to slow down diarrhea or stop it. You can make a stronger extract of it and use it to tan leather, turn rawhide into leather. So it's got a whole range of different things that it's useful for. I've also used it preventatively on my skin to keep sunburns from happening. That's something I used to do all the time when I was younger. I don't really do that so much anymore now. I usually I often use store-bought sunscreen if I'm going to use any at all. But when I was younger and had no money and was a homeless teenager, that's what I used. So it's great for a lot of different things, and it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It belongs to everybody, and it's a good thing to know about. It also has, like I said, it's adapted to the types of changes that humans make to the environment. So I want to talk just a little bit about that. One of the things which you saw is that it will grow in lawns that are mowed. So it will grow up above the grass before the grass gets a chance to grow. It can put up leaves quickly because it's got this center, it's got the basal rosette, which is leaves growing out in all different directions. If those get chopped or munched or whatever, there's a little bud in the middle of that that can very quickly be turned into new leaves. It's like the leaves are already kind of fully formed in there, and it just has to add water and stretch them out to the size of regular leaves. So they can grow, in the course of 2 days into full-size leaves, as long as that central bud is still there for them to grow from. And then it's up on top of the grass collecting the sunlight. And it's not much bothered by being stepped on or eaten by sheep or cut by lawnmowers or anything like that. So it's very well adapted to the sort of things that humans do to grassy habitats, humans and their animals and machines and so forth. Also, it produces lots of tiny little seeds that tend to distribute themselves by getting mixed in with mud or getting stuck to the feet of people or animals. Can get in your boot treads. They can get in your probably in your tire treads. They can get in the hooves of animals. They can get in between your toes. If you're ever walking barefoot through a field that has plantain in it, the seed heads will actually get caught between your toes and pop off, and then you get them out from between your toes and they grow in the new place. So it's actually been very successful at using humans and livestock to get itself distributed all throughout the world. Originally, it's from Southwest Asia and the Mediterranean area, and from ancient Egyptian and Anatolian times up until now, it's managed to find its way all over the world. And it's traveled with humans when humans have traveled. So it's very widespread now in temperate zones. It doesn't grow in the Arctic, doesn't grow in the desert, and there are probably islands and stuff like that where it doesn't grow. But where there's soil and where there's temperate zones, it's very common to find it in any kind of grassy area. So that is a good plant to know about. I'm acting as though you have no prior knowledge of herbal medicines and just kind of helping to build up your repertoire of medicinal herbs one by one. And it's one of the first ones I would want to tell you about because it has such a wide variety of different uses, and because it can be used with basically no preparation. You can pick it, crush it up, put it right on your skin, and that's how you use it. It's not as good to dry it or make it into a tincture or anything like that. It has some of its properties if you do that, but the fresh plant is actually really the ideal way to use it and the most traditional way to use it. Just a minute, I'll be right back. All right. So another herb that I want to talk to you about today is yarrow. And I would say that if I had to pick just one herb uh, to work with, that I would be very sad about that, but that yarrow would be my choice. Yarrow is a wonderful and incredible medicine, and it has a very long history of medicinal use. And like Plantago, it's really not a widely marketed herb. You can order it probably from herb companies or whatever, but if you went into your local place that sells supplements, they probably would not have yarrow. Um, and yet, people have used it for a long, long time. There is some archaeological evidence that's been interpreted as meaning that the Neanderthals were using it tens of thousands of years ago. So it's been in use for. It was already ancient when people started writing things down about medicine. The use of yarrow was already a long established thing, which may be true of a lot of herbs, but yarrow is it's an aromatic plant that grows wild. It grows wild in Eurasia and it grows wild in North America, and it's native to both places. Or, maybe people brought it to North America from Eurasia when they came over here. Who knows? But it appears to have been present both in North America and in Eurasia before there was much back and forth between the two land masses. It grows in Africa as well. Not sure if it grows in Australia, but it probably could. It's a member of the same family as dandelion, the Compositae family. Hang on a second. I want to try and find a picture of it. Okay, so this is yarrow. This is what the flowers look like. And you can see these white things that look like the petals, but if you look in the middle of those, you'll see all these little tiny flowers. Those are the actual flowers, the very small things in the center of each of the little sets of petals. So that's what the top of yarrow looks like. And it has many tiny flowers. And then the leaves are finely divided and sort of feathery. And so its species name is millefolium. Its name is Achillea millefolium. Millefolium meaning 1,000 leaves, because each leaf looks like it's made up of 1,000 smaller leaves. They're feathery. When you crush them up, they're aromatic. They have a camphory type of smell to them. You can find this plant growing in taller fields, sometimes along trails, in meadows, edges of woods, often edges of coniferous woodlands. And like I said, it's very widespread and often grows around human habitations where the grass isn't cut too much. And it's a perennial. It'll grow in the same place for year after year. In my language, in Irish, it's called Ahar Talún, which means Earth Father, because it's something from the earth that's been used for a really long time, and also because it kind of maybe reminded people of white hair, how it's white on the top. The genus name is Achillea, and it is named after Achilles, who was a warrior in ancient Greek stories, who is supposed to have fought at the battle of the Trojan War, and he used this plant in the Iliad. He uses this plant to treat people's battlefield injuries, rubbing it between his hands and sprinkling the powder on the injury. And if you do that, it will soak up the blood and it will stop the bleeding. I've used it on some pretty gnarly wounds when I've had occasion to, when there was no access to any more definitive sort of care. And it does admirably for that type of situation. It will usually cause the edges of the wound to seal together nicely and to start healing very quickly. For that purpose, the way I like to use yarrow, I don't really like to put powder into wounds the way Achilles did, although plenty of people do, plenty of herbalists do. I don't like that very much. But what I like to do with it is make a mash of it with either crushing it up fresh or grinding it up and then mixing it with water until it's sort of a wet mush in either case. And then using something like a cloth or a nonstick pad or a piece of gauze to wrap that in and then put that against the wound so that the juices from it are able to get to the wound, but the bits of it don't get stuck to the wound. So that's how I like to use it. You know, like I said, I've used it on some pretty bad flesh wounds, skin wounds, and it does tend to make them start growing together and healing up. I've also made an infusion from it, a very strong tea. We'll get into a little bit of how infusions are made soon, and how different forms of medicines are made soon after we've talked a little bit more about how plants grow. But a spray made from a water-based extract of yarrow can be a really great thing for wounds because you can wash them out with it, and it helps the healing process to start, and it also kills bacteria. So it's one of the best herbs out there to use topically on wounds. It's not as easy to come by as Plantago is, but it is stronger, and it will work on more serious wounds. And it does have a stronger anti-infective effect than the Plantago has. So those are part of how it's used. And then it has some other uses as well. If it's made into a tea and drunk, then that will break up congestion. It's got this very aromatic, how do I describe it? It has a cold, bitter smell to it. This is tincture of yarrow, but it's cold and bitter and aromatic. You know, unfortunately, I don't have smell enabled on Zoom, or I would let y'all take a sniff of it. But it's really helpful for just sort of taking the sting out of things, taking the heat out of injuries while keeping the circulation going to them. And when it's taken internally, it's good for fevers. And in small amounts, it's kind of cooling. In larger amounts, it induces sweating, and the sweating can help someone cool off if they have a very high fever. So during the pandemic, when I was working with some people who were, you know, experiencing higher fevers along with respiratory stuff, this was really helpful for both getting people to sweat so that they don't have as much of a fever, so that their body is cooling itself down, as well as opening up the airways, breaking up congestion, things like that. I didn't use it alone in those situations. I used it with a lot of other things, but I have used it alone, and I've been present when other people were using it, when other herbalists were using it for some things like malaria, which I don't really see a lot of malaria here, but malaria is a very common disease worldwide. It's a febrile illness. The first time someone gets it, which if they live in an area where it lives is usually when they're pretty young, it can be dangerous. And so the induction of sweating really helps to cool people's bodies off, really helps to bring those fevers down, often makes people a lot more comfortable, often makes the sickness, whatever it is, even if it's just a common cold or something like that, often makes it get better faster. The aromatic part of it is really decongesting, helps to clear up the airways. People start feeling it really immediately, like they can breathe through their sinuses again. It'll break up congestion in the chest. If somebody's got a lot of coughing and rattling in their chest, a lot of the time if they take yarrow, it'll provoke that coughing, but it'll get everything out. And so it will not feel as bad while it's coming out. So a lot of the time with that sort of thing, what you get is you get phlegm and you also get swelling, and the swelling keeps the phlegm from being able to come out. So the yarrow cools that swelling down and also pushes the coughing so that people cough more. And this is something that not only yarrow does, but a lot of aromatic plants will do, is have a combination of cooling and expectorant effect that is really great for breaking up congestion, especially if it's been going on for a few days and somebody's been coughing a lot and it, has gotten to the point where it hurts to cough. This is the stuff. It's really good for that situation. So, it has these disparate, kind of unconnected to each other medicinal properties. I say unconnected to each other because they're involving different systems of the human body, but there are certain substances in yarrow that have a lot to do with each of them. For instance, there's a class of substances called quinones, and the quinones are bitter and they induce sweating, and they're also antibacterial. So it's doing all of that. And then there's also camphorol, which is kind of an aromatic thing that breaks up congestion, cools the respiratory system, is cooling topically. So that's a part of what it's doing too. It also contains some tannins, some astringent substances, which cause the tissue to tighten up. And I'm convinced that it contains a lot of other substances that we don't know about, because its pharmacology has not been nearly as looked into as that of some other herbs, which is an unfortunate thing to find out about herbs, is that a lot of the time, if you have an herb like yarrow, there will be a list of different substances that people have identified in that plant, different chemicals that we know are part of the makeup of that plant. But, and that will be quite extensive for yarrow, but we don't necessarily know what all of them do or what sorts of effects they're having on people. And especially if they're not things, especially the ones that are not found in a bunch of other herbs, like if there were unique substances to yarrow that weren't found in other plants besides yarrow, we might not know what they were. If you go into yarrow and you're looking for quinones and you're looking for camphorol, you know how to find them if that's the sort of thing that you do. So you can identify them. But if there were other substances that were unique to it, we probably wouldn't necessarily know about those. Hang on a second. Can I spell these words? I'm going to write down some words like quinones, camphorol, and what else? Tannins. These are some of the types of substances that are in there. And you don't necessarily need to know specifically what those chemicals are, but I'm just kind of pointing it out that there are multiple different classes of chemicals, of phytochemicals, secondary phytochemicals, by which I mean medicinal substances in yarrow that we don't necessarily know that much about, and some that we do know about because they're in other plants as well. So even though we've been using it for hundreds of centuries, apparently. It is still somewhat mysterious exactly what it does in terms of on an atomic level, on a cellular level. It's much easier to find that sort of data about plants that have a lot of money behind them, where people are putting money into researching them because they're selling them and they've got, the market on echinacea or on black cohosh or whatever it is in their region, which you can't really do with yarrow because it's a weed and it's everywhere. With the other plants, you can't really own them or patent them, but you can control the supply chain without too much trouble because they only grow in certain areas, and you can go into those areas and offer a better price for them and quickly become a major player in the worldwide distribution of an herb like golden seal here, which is a very yellow root, sometimes called yellow root here in Kentucky. And it's something that, people harvest from the wild. And it's vulnerable to over-harvesting, but it's also economically valuable. And so people know about hydrastine, which is in golden seal and not really in many, if any, other plants, because people have put the money into figuring out what exactly is in golden seal that makes it different than the other yellow astringent antiseptic type plants out there. So, yarrow hasn't quite got the same treatment. Most plants haven't. Really, it's only a handful of ones that have, but that handful tends to consist of ones that are marketed on sort of a multinational scale, and maybe have been important to the pharmaceutical or to the practice of pharmacy at times in the past. Some of the research is pretty old. So yarrow is again not so much something that there's been an extensive amount of research on in that way, although we do have a very extensive history of use for it, not only in the Iliad but also in just about every herbal written in medieval times or earlier. This was something that people used, and was a very common part of domestic medicine in former times and to some extent still. So it would be the sort of thing that 100 years ago everybody knew about yarrow. It was something that your average housewife would use for their kids, or that people would use while they were out on a job site if they got hurt, stuff like that. Very common thing. I've heard hunters talk about animals laying down in beds of it after they've been injured. And that's, you can find that sort of story. I've heard that sort of story from people who say they've witnessed it in modern times, and I've seen that sort of story referenced in medieval herbals and things like that. So it's something that's been part of human history for a long time, maybe in some cases even played a pivotal role in battles being lost and won and stuff like that, but it's not a commercial product for the most part. It's a weed and a living thing that forms part of the ecosystem in a lot of different places. And so it's kind of not so much viewed as a commodity, for better and for worse. So there's definitely some upsides to that. Nobody's trying to keep you from harvesting yarrow. Nobody's really trying to say that the yarrow is all theirs or anything like that. Nor could they really, since it grows in so many places. But it's also, maybe more neglected than I think it deserves to be, with as versatile and useful as it is. Also, it can be used topically on the scalp to help hair grow thicker and grow longer without breaking. So it's got some good skincare qualities and applications as well. And like I said, it's been used by a wide variety of different cultures, from Native Americans, ancient Greeks, people in Central Asia, in as far back as records go, all over the place. So it's to me a very powerful piece of human heritage, and a very powerful and versatile herbal medicine. And yeah, so I think it's a really good one to familiarize yourself with. It's not, I haven't seen it blooming yet this year, but it is starting to grow. So when you find an area where there's yarrow, what will happen is there will be the feathery leaves just right coming up out of the ground. And that's what you'll see a good chunk of the year. And then in early summer, it starts sending up stalks that bloom into the white flowers that I showed you. And you can find those maybe from late May to September or so. And when it goes to seed, it makes thousands and thousands and thousands of little tiny seeds. And so it tends to both grow back from the root year after year and reseed itself year after year. So I have, my mom has some yarrow growing in her yard that her husband, I think, brought from what used to be his family's farm in North Dakota, where he grew up. And I believe the story is that the yarrow on that farm had been brought there from Ukraine when they moved there, whenever that was, generations earlier. So it's an easy plant to take with you and grow in your new home. And you don't really have to do anything. You just put the seeds out in the yard and it starts growing. So it's if it's something you wanted to have around you, you could probably find a place where nobody would mow it and just let it grow there. It's a really good persistent plant, and it will sometimes grow in the same place, for many, many years at a time. And like I said, subject to the plant community changing, to the environment changing, but it will grow in a lawn or it will grow in tall grass. So it's not as susceptible. It can grow pretty tall. It can grow a few feet tall. So it will grow in a taller grass meadow and not just in a flat lawn. So it's a really good plant for you to get to know, both in terms of being able to identify it by sight and in terms of like smelling it, feeling it, getting to know what it's like to use it. It's a really good, if you only are using a few herbs, it should definitely be one of them. All right. Any questions about yarrow or about plantain? All right. Well, in the near future, we'll meet a couple times before this, but be thinking about in the message I sent everybody. I was talking about having an herb walk towards the end of May, the last weekend in May. So I hope that everyone who is local can come to that, and I will probably live stream it as well. So it's going to be a good chance to get to see a wide variety of different medicinal plants at the same time. And if you do plan to come to it, let me know so that I can plan where we're going based on how many people are going to be showing up. But that will be in just a few weeks, just a couple weeks. And I'm really looking forward to getting a chance to do that with everybody. And yeah, so that will be soon, and probably next week I'll go into a little more detailed instructions about how to press plants so that everybody can be working on that project. I think the sooner you get started on that, the better it's going to go for you, because right now there's a lot of stuff growing, blooming, in a state where it's easier to find and identify and stuff like that. So I think that if you try and get that done over the course of the next few months, you won't have the whole winter where nothing's growing to worry about the fact that you haven't gotten it done yet. So that's a good thing to be getting started on. And probably next time we'll talk some about the ins and outs of how to press plants. But you know, the main thing is if you are pressing them, you want to press them with enough weight that they get all the juice squeezed out of them, and press them on a type of paper where the juice is going to get absorbed into the paper. So not glossy paper, because then they'll just kind of sit there and be wet and mold. But if it's a matte finished paper, it will soak up the juices and they'll dry. So that's something to be thinking about. And of course, if you want to do it with photographs, that's very okay too, but try and make sure that you're getting, in either case, flowers, leaves, and stems whenever possible, so that it's an identifiable specimen of the species that you're labeling it as. All right. Anything else? Any other questions for today?
I have a question about the anti-inflammatory properties of plantains. Can that be like made into a salve, and like, does it work?
You can, but it doesn't work as well as a salve as some other things do. A lot of people do make plantain salves, but most of the really good stuff in it is a lot more dissolvable in water than it is in oil. So some of the salicin is going to get out into oil, but mostly it's going to work better as a poultice or something like that than it would as a salve.
Or like a body spray.
Or a spray or something like that would be another way to do it. Yeah, because the substances that make it what it is tend to be water soluble rather than oil soluble.
And it's probably just mostly superficial, though. It wouldn't help with like muscle inflammation or like.
Well, I mean, it would actually. There are other things like willow and violet that might be better for that. But if Plantago was what you had and you made a tea out of it and took it internally, then you could definitely use it for that.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. And if anybody thinks of any questions, feel free to text me, message me, anything like that. And I will talk to you again next week. Thank you.